problems that are really hard are because their short-term benefits or costs don't.
Well, it's like moving past the shiny thing, right? Like
Right.
if there's like the thing that can prod you to do like an A/B stimuli,
Right.
It's already done. You've
Right.
already hit that part.
So,
So
yeah.
now it's like how do you change like?
So our society is great at feeding what you want instantly. Endless entertainment, information,
Yeah.
calories, all that stuff. But how do you
Helping you get to do the hard stuff.
do the hard
The
stuff?
challenging stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why the skills become so big all of a sudden. Yeah.
I feel like the fifth leading cause of death is poor choices. I feel like that's like the
Maybe higher.
Or the not first. Probably say.
I mean, if you think about heart disease being related to choices. And
Sorry.
Bad driving, like distracted driving.
So I have number 5, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's also kind of hard to think
how do you
about.
categorize it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's high, and it's our fault. So.
A lot of times it's because people are high. So. Sorry, it was just some kind of statement.
So you guys are new faces. Team it up.
All three of us were UX designers.
Oh, cool.
Awesome.
This topic has been interesting.
Yeah.
For sure, for sure.
Do y'all work together somewhere?
No, I work at Bed Bath & Beyond, but they.
We intern at the public library.
Oh, nice.
So we're helping them with their website and stuff.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's a lot of work, and we're targeting so many users and try to cater the information architecture to them.
Right.
That's been
If you could work on their their meeting reservation system for your public room. Thank you.
Yeah, it's kind of, we just opened up all these issues and now we're going to tackle them about our.
Cool. How long are you?
Well, it's not something that was like by the school or like an official internship.
Okay.
It's like a volunteership.
Nice.
But we're working with the stakeholders and like the team leaders and stuff to get some actionable stuff out there. So I say it's an internship because we're doing all the same stuff.
Sure. Cool. And how much
In total.
are you guys gonna dev it or are you gonna
No.
hand it off to them?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've been on it since July, and I plan on staying on it until I just get too busy to not be able to do it anymore. I think he's been on since last January.
Yeah, I've been there for quite a long time.
Okay.
Slowly getting things done. It's very hard to get things to be approved and get the developer to work on it too. Just because even the developer has so much stuff going on.
Is it a City of Austin employee that's developing it?
Sort of, yeah, because he works on the library stuff, but he also works on other parts of the city website things.
They have a lot of work to do in the City of Austin.
Yeah.
I feel like their website is like designed for mobile circa like 2005.
Yeah.
Maybe. It's like you have every time you go to one of their pages, you have to scroll down like 3 thumbs to get to the content that you want to. Well, cool. Keep up the good work. Not to put you on the spot, but welcome.
Thank you. I'm Martha.
Martha.
Yeah.
Cool. What brought you to? How'd you find us?
I'm a designer.
Cool.
And I think design is all about merging function and beauty.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Right on. Well, you picked the right day to come.
Yeah.
But we do this monthly, so we always talk about design and psychology and behavioral science and behavioral economics every 4th Monday, I guess. So, yeah. If you like what you hear, come back. We're usually across the hall, but we got preempted by somebody else. Yes.
Astro Boy needs some people. So I'm gonna go out and get my appendix from you.
It's a little intense.
It's a little. I want just like a warmer shade for Astro Boy. Is there a comment box?
Yeah, which to that name, Astro Boy, you think it would be a more
I know.
neon color.
Yeah.
Yeah. I could do like a purple blue.
Turn it off, everyone put on their cell phones on the right side.
Yeah.
Concert.
Are we talking aesthetics already?
What's that?
We're talking aesthetics already?
Yes.
Just warming up to the topic. Speaking of which, what do you think of my AI generated?
I assumed it was AI generated.
Yeah.
Pretty good. What were your inputs?
Well, first I just put in Hassan's description of the thing, and then I knew he was trying to do like a Beauty and the Beast play on words, so I like pushed it to do that, but then it got super weird, so I backed away from that. And then the hardest thing, this is like, you know, any of us that have worked with, you know, ChatGPT and others, like trying to get it to have a seamless edge. So like I knew it was going to go on this white background, and I was like, I want it to be on a white background. I want all 4 edges to be completely white, and it was like, great, I did exactly what you asked. And it'd be like, as you see there, like that,
like a box.
that red edge and that blue edge, it like could not comprehend what I was trying to tell it. I like literally was like, look at all 4 edges, top, bottom, left, right. I want them to all be 100% white at the edge and like fading to color. And every time it was like, yes, okay, I understand you completed, or repeat back the instructions.
What is the top and the bottom?
Yeah, no, I mean, the effect on the top and the bottom is kind of cool. But... And then I was like, I like this artwork. Now, zoom out, and then make a white border around it. You don't understand.
Oh, it is. Yeah, it doesn't have continuity from one picture to the next. The way ChatGPT does it.
Well, this was ChatGPT using DALL-E, but it couldn't edit the image like Midjourney does.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I couldn't say, I love this, now do this other thing with it. It was like, I'll start over again with the same prompt. So,
Just out of curiosity.
welcome our speaker.
Welcome.
You're right on time. There's probably still a few people that will celebrate.
Just out of curiosity, how many people have heard of the field of behavioral design before?
Yeah.
And describe that one? Okay, awesome. How many would self-describe as like working in that field already?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. How many people are dabbling, or how about behavioral economics? How many are studying or reading about that?
I mean, sales and finance count for any of that?
What's that?
Sales and finance count for any of that?
Well, I would argue that whatever you're doing, you're already doing it.
Yeah, you are, right?
The question is like how sophisticated your techniques are, how up to date with science they are, and that kind of thing. But we're all wrestling with it, even when it's just deciding what to eat for breakfast in the morning. We're all always trying to adjust our behavior. So, actually, when I was in BJ Funk's behavioral design lab at Stanford, we did a study to inform a kind of study to assess how much of the day people are dealing with habits and trying to adjust habits, and there, I've seen several other studies like that. And arguably, most of the day is spent wrestling with trying to do something different than what you habitually do, and ending up failing most of the time. We have a lot of good habits, of course, but there's a lot of cases where we're trying to every day I need to plan properly for the day, or every day I need to not put 3 scoops of sugar in my coffee and only 1, and every day I need to, and then we end up moral licensing it. Oh, you dropped it. Yeah, I know. It's it's fine. It's socially viral.
So if
while we're waiting, feel free to make a friend, meet the people next to you, say hello, don't be shy.
It's very Monday.
Did you start this documentary then? That's a great compliment. This is the year I can say So, but I cannot go to a customer and say, the only application that I have is which one is this? But I don't think designers or so it's interesting to like a lot of these are not a replacement for this work. They're almost
There you go.
It's also like travel.
Get much natural light. Class where I realized sometimes we like ask each other to like look up our package, but that's not really social connection. Your last One of the benefits of not having houses downtown now I just have to find out
Welcome to the first Action Design Network ATX meeting of the year. Thank you for coming. Glad to see we have a big group. And I think we have just enough chairs. So thank you for squeezing in. I'll make this quick. So you're here tonight to see Hassan's amazing presentation, which I can tell you is going to be awesome. But we do this every month. So every fourth Monday, I think we are here at Capital Factory. We're usually over there, but we got kicked out by somebody who doesn't even appear to be using it, but that's fine. And every month we talk about all things behavior and design. So behavioral science, behavioral economics, UX, gamification, digital psychology, whatever kind of angle you want to come at it, that's kind of what we like to talk about. We also do a book club every now and again, reading books about those same topics. So if you like what you hear, then I hope you'll come back next month, and so on and so on. A few kind of things I'm supposed to announce. One is we are very grateful to Capital Factory for being a sponsor. They give us this free space, which when post-COVID, we tried to get back quickly into doing live events and had to go try and find free places around Austin. It's really, really hard, and we were in tiny libraries with a TV like this big. So we're very grateful to Capital Factory for hosting us. We are also sponsored by Live Ground Labs, which is the company founded by Robin, and Sarah and I are work there as well. We do behavioral consulting. And one last announcement. More to come on this topic, but Action Design Network is becoming Bessie. There you go. You're ahead of the curve. Bessie is an international organization for all these things, for behavioral design, applied behavioral science. There's like I said, there's more to come on that topic, but in the meantime, when you look at the meetup, it's Action Design Network, at some point in the future it will switch to Bessie, so just keep your eyes open, don't be confused when that happens, and keep coming to our events. And I think we've got one more seat for you if you want to squeeze in. Yeah, so without further ado, Hassan's going to tell us about his research into aesthetics, and how that influences behavior, and you're going to love it. And we're going to have some time for questions afterwards. So thanks for coming, Hassan. Thank you. We'll grab a couple more.
Oh yeah, exactly. I'm glad it's not turned towards me.
I was like, I think something's happening.
Yeah.
Also, it means that I'm in the center of the room to be on the camera.
It also means if you do something awful, we have time to cut the live feed.
Oh, well, that's more important.
Hassan, I have a question while they get set up.
Yeah.
If you had a walk-up song for this presentation, what would it be?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a very hard question. I don't know. I think I'm just going to do generic "lose yourself." That's probably. Okay. So. Okay. So it's been a while actually since I've done an in-person talk. It's really nice that I don't know how to not be sitting, but. Thank you everyone for coming. This is great to have such an audience. I'm going to be talking to you today about how beauty intersects with behavior. And I want to do it through various different lenses, but I want to lead it specifically through my field of research, which has to do with neuroaesthetics. So before I get started, I want to ask a question, and this is breakfast, actually pictures from breakfast that I made this morning. And I made 2 different plates. One for my spouse and one for me. I'll tell you the one I took later, but I'd like you to just pick which one, if you were presented out of these 2 plates, which one would you pick?
Oatmeal.
A.
Oatmeal.
Why is that?
Because I make oatmeal in my breakfast every day. But yeah, A, of course.
Okay. So as you'll notice, there's certain design things about option A, some inconsistencies. There's that symmetry. There's just the way that it's been plated, the way it's been organized. So this was I could have taken an image off of actual people that design plates, but I wanted to do it myself to show that like this is not something that you have to be a culinary expert to do. This is something that you can, if you're trying to eat healthy, you can either, do the plate that I made for myself, or you can make the plate that I made for my spouse, introducing color, introducing symmetry, things that make the plate look more attractive to you, right? And that's the key of behavior, is to make things more attractive so that you'll do them, so that they catch your attention. So I wanted to just start off there to just show that impact that like in everyday life, aesthetics can have and beauty can have. And I will call that beautiful. So the claim is that beauty and behavior are deeply connected. Beauty doesn't just modify behavior. From the fringes, it is central to what shapes behavior. And that's what I hope to convince you today. So to convince you of that, I have to walk you through this field of neuroaesthetics that I did my PhD in. And so the aim of neuroaesthetics, and by the way, this was before neuro started getting added to everything as a prefix, 20 years ago, when it was still cool. So neuroaesthetics aims to use scientific methods to explain the psychological, neuronal, and social-cultural basis of aesthetic perceptions and judgments. So it's going at the fundamental questions about what we like, why we like, but it's trying to do it from this vantage point of the brain. How can we actually measure things in the brain and see how that can inform these questions, which are, by the way, one of the earliest questions in psychology. If you go to the origins of psychology, Gustav Fechner was what some people call the father of psychology, and he did aesthetics experiments, and they were about preference. So it really does come down to psychology and its deep roots of aesthetics. So when I say aesthetics, though, and beauty, you might think of art, right? In an experience like this, where you're in front of a painting and you're contemplating and you're being sophisticated. But I want to also convince you today that beauty is not just that. It's something that's in every facet of our life. It's, I'm sure, influenced your decisions and your perception as you walked in here today. It's about the architecture of the building that we're currently in. It's about the music that I'm going to be listening to as I walk up to my presentation. It's about the fashion sense that I don't have. It's about the plating that you can, as I illustrated earlier. And especially it's about nature, right? It's everywhere. There's a reason why everybody lines up to see the sunset. There's something beautiful, there's something attractive about it. And so it's not just art. When I talk about beauty, I talk about it in a very, very grand sense that it involves multiple aspects of our behavior, and almost every aspect. And that's what I'm hoping that I can convince you today as well. So beauty, and then so the way I want to think about beauty is about as aesthetic values. So they're rooted, if they're part of all these things, that means they're also rooted in all the things and the cognition that's involved in interacting with all these things. So it's involved in social learning and meeting, as we know. For example, facial symmetry is a highly salient cue for attractiveness, for choice. It's involved in pleasure, in therapy, in creativity, in sociology, culture, and personality, and how we represent ourselves, and emotion, trust, and morality. So as I'll show some evidence later, in the choices that you make, in the purchases that you make, there's perception of beauty that plays a role, and actually doesn't just go as, I hate to say use the word shallow, but it doesn't go, it goes past beauty, it goes towards like people that we find beautiful, we tend to think that they're more moral, we tend to trust them more, and so forth. And of course, associated with that is cognitive processes that have to do with attention, memory, decision making, and all that falls into the field that a lot of you might be in, which has to do with marketing and design. And these are things that are not new to you. You design things. When I created this PowerPoint, Canva has symmetry built into it for a specific reason. So, what specifically is beauty? How can we answer that question? It's a very, very old question. It's not a new question at all, and I think if the philosophers are in the audience today, they would say that it's still not solved. But this is one of the questions that I tackled during my research, but from a neuroscientific sense. So there's contrasting philosophies. One is that beauty is universal. So that Plato, for example, said that beauty is independent of the observer's experience. It exists out there as a property of the world. Aristotle said beauty is defined by measurable properties such as symmetry. You actually define the properties, order, balance, and proportion. These might be things that you're familiar with if you're some sort of designer or an architect or a creator. However, there's another side to this, right? So beauty is individual. So Hume said that beauty doesn't lie in objects, it is a matter of feelings and emotions. It's how you feel about it at the moment. And this personal aspect of taste, a concept that taste is personal and cannot be logical or cognitive. You can't dictate what is beautiful or what your taste should be. So you can imagine this is not a small debate. And I think for good reason, because it's likely that, as we'll find, the answer is that it's both. Right? There's no reason to think that beauty has to be either objective or subjective. It can be both, and why not? So, and this is evidence that shows for it. So evidence for objectivity in aesthetic preference is that, for example, when you survey the world population, this is just one of many examples. Which one of the colors listed below you like the most? You see the overwhelming preference is for blue across all nationalities, across all countries. And then it sort of varies to a certain degree, but blue is really up there. And anybody sort of have a reason for why blue might be up there?
Sky, the ocean, most familiar.
Yeah, exactly. So there's that connection, evolutionary connection that comes from what we call objective, right? So objective, what is objective? Objective is something that happens pre our lifetimes that's sort of imprinted on us, right? And what's imprinted on us is things that are consistent enough. So things like that are, the sky, the color of the sky, I don't think has changed from blue. Water has not changed. So these are things that are just consistent and around enough, and also beneficial enough. There's a whole other world of color, ecology, and preference that I want to get into, but it's extremely complicated. But what it really boils down to as well is that our preferences for color, for example, also correlate with our preferences for the objects that those colors inhabit. So if we tend to like an object, we'll tend to like the color of that object as well.
Blue also is in here for this question as well, that when blue skies are visible again, winter's ending, monsoon's ending. So
good signal. And
also, as a nomadic species, when you start to see blue water again,
yeah,
you're in obviously reasons. You also like green, like the heat. So it's interesting that green is around, but there's lushness.
Exactly. Yeah, the green is really interesting because I think how it's presented on the screen might not be naturalistic in how it's presented elsewhere. So there's the validity. I think that in other studies you definitely find that in color ecology studies. That's a really good point. There's also then this evidence for subjectivity in aesthetic preference. So this study looked at symmetry preference in these patterns here. And so these patterns, it's a little bit hard to see, but they vary in the type of symmetry that they have and the amount of symmetry that they have. So here there's one fold of symmetry, 2-fold, 3 folds, and 5 folds, the amount of symmetry that's included. And a large population of UK and Egyptian students were studied for this, and they found that as the symmetry itself got more complex, the relative preference actually increased for Egyptian populations. Here, does anybody have any guesses for why that might be happening?
Sure. Muslim countries, so they can't. They're not allowed to depict images, right? So their art is all based on symmetry.
Exactly. So it's the amount of, again, familiarity, but this time it's learned familiarity, right? So this is now the subjective part, but it's still learned. So it's either imprinted or it's learned. But exactly as was pointed out, that in the Islamic world, faces in art are more centered around geometric shapes, which tend to have predominant amounts of symmetry. So there's likely better processing and more familiarity with this type of symmetry. So subjectivity can happen across populations, but we know, for example, just from our own experience, that can happen in individuals as well. So that's sort of the answer that we get from the behavioral evidence out there, that there's two lines of evidence. What if we look in the brain? Is there an aesthetic circuit in the brain? And this was actually a really big question when neuroaesthetics started out as a field, because there was some good reason to think that, you know, if aesthetics is so important, there should be some sort of an aesthetic part of the brain, some aesthetic area that lights up when you find something beautiful. And we still don't have, I think, the right tools to be able to answer a question like that. But we do find something interesting when we start to explore this question a little bit more. And in these studies, the question is not often explored through questions around beauty, but it's explored through questions about preference. So a nice way to be able to understand, like, how does the brain represent preference and beauty is to look at different senses, right? And how beautiful do you find something in your vision? How beautiful does it sound? How beautiful does it taste? Does it smell? And if all that, where does all that map up? So this is a meta-analysis of 95 brain imaging studies about aesthetic appraisal across all these senses. And don't worry at all about the brain regions here, unless you can name them off the top of your head. But the real goal is for you to understand that this conception of aesthetic preference and appraisal activates brain areas that are related to value-based decision circuit. So the underlying circuit that's really the root of beauty is not some, you know, esoteric thing. It's not some philosophical thing that somebody's thinking, you know, this is beautiful, and then I'm going to actually do real things in the world. This is real things in the world. This is value-based decision making. It has to do with reward, has to do with this internal sensation of how I'm currently feeling. That's how you make appraisal. How beautiful do you find something depends on how you currently feel, the sense of pleasure that you get from it, the reward that you get from it, and then this multi-sensory integration and reward that has to do with this subjective value. And all of these, as you see, are connected to ideas of decision and attention and choice. That's fundamentally what beauty ends up being about, and that's fundamentally, if you think about it, is what behavior is about as well.
So just to connect this back to the last slide, is pleasure, for instance, intended to represent multisensory pleasure and multisensory, multisensory integration is one of the titles, but is this answering in the affirmative that there is a correlate across the senses?
Yes, yes. So this is the overlap that was found when you look at all these studies across all the senses. Where is the most common overlaps? And the nucleus accumbens, what this stands for, is the pleasure center that was activated, and this was activated consistently across, you know, audition, gustation, across all these senses. So a similar pleasure circuitry is activated. So you can extend this further, right? This is just talking about the aesthetic, and this has been extended further in detail that I don't have time to go into, but the aesthetic experience itself and beauty are connected to this, what's thought of this triad. That, you know, the portion that I pointed out has to do with emotion and valuation, reward, wanting and liking, those circuits. But there's circuits around sensory motor. When you look at, for example, a statue, there's interesting studies about how your motor regions lights up in a similar way as the posture that the statue has, for example. And then there's also a really, really fascinating field of study that has to do with expertise and how that changes your aesthetic preference. So as I'm sure, you know, the designers in the room will attest to, or the fashionistas in the room will attest to, that as you develop that sense of taste and expertise and knowledge, your preferences change over time. None of us are the same as we were in terms of how we dress, what we wear, what we like over time. This was a huge part of my dissertation research. I'm not going to be presenting on that today, but if you're curious, I can definitely share that with you, about how we learn over our lifetimes, how we change over our lifetimes. Because the simple answer is that we do, and that's connected, that's not just a arbitrary thing, it's connected to our internal values, it's connected to our behavior, and the types of decisions that we make.
Now it's changing by the month. My son in freshman high school, he said they follow TikTok trendsetters. when something starts to pick up, they just wait to buy because they're waiting to see when it tips over, and it's like a month by month basis, and then the whole school changes their clothing because of what the that. And then he'll report that looks nice or looks like that his aesthetics have actually changed, which is yay for marketers for pointing out.
Yeah. I mean, my daughter, for example, she's 3. She loved pink. Like, and knowing all this was like, I'm not going to enculturate her into pink. I just, like if she likes it, and I didn't, and somehow it just happened. This is just the way things are. When you're walking around the store, there's just more pink things, and we pick up these things, right? But Frozen came out, and now she hates pink. And it just changed. It went from pink to blue. Yeah. It's just opposite ends of the spectrum. It's amazing how preference reflects this underlying change as well. But that is what it reflects. That is the purpose.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So that's a very good example, pink to blue.
Yeah.
But your daughter got the blue from Frozen. Who showed her Frozen? Who got it from pink to blue? Right. So
that was me.
I mean, here, who is people who created Frozen, right? So I'm trying to get to the point where how do I get to the place where I can be the creator of that blue or the trendsetter who goes and says, all right, pink is done, it's old, try this. Will this scale help me? Will this value help me find that next thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a very good question. And I think it has to do with I think you'll find the second half of my talk interesting, because I think the change comes from social components. I mean, it definitely comes from your own experience, and we've built, that's what you're talking about is learning, right? So learning happens, and this was also a fundamental component because of in my research I was exploring how our preferences change over time. And these circuits before us showed that what's happening is actually learning. Our aesthetic preferences are a reflection of what we've learned, and they're a signal of what we've learned. Right? So then, what does that mean? How can we actually modulate that? So there's multiple things in it. It's your own experience. It's the social environment that you're in. It's the actual physical environment that you're in. Right? So if you move to a desert, you're going to be surrounding yourself with a whole different landscape of colors. And there's actually really interesting studies where that does happen. Below the equator, there's a markedly different preference for hues of yellow than there is above the equator, or just at the equator. And so just the amount of exposure you're getting is something, and then culturally, as we saw earlier, is another thing. So many different factors go into it, but it all comes down to your individual experience, the environment and situation that you're in. So what is beauty? So it is our perception. Our perception of what is beautiful is shaped by many factors. Regardless of the source, though, what is beautiful begs our attention. This is what I hope to convince you and show you next. And then I also hope to show you that this logical conclusion that attention shapes our choice or behavior. Where you look, and this is not something that, I'm just saying this is something that's shown over and over in research, and I'm sure the marketers in here know a lot about this, is that where you pay attention is what you're likely to consider more, and that actually leads to a preference of that consideration. It's what, fundamentally what a bias is, right? So therefore beauty, biases are behavior. It's creating that bias from diverting your attention to a thing that is more beautiful, or away from attention from the thing that's less beautiful. So here's an example of how beauty draws attention. So this was a research study, and it's been done multiple times, where infants show a preference for beautiful faces. This is just a set of the faces that they saw. There was a whole control study of different variations, but a simple, a simplistic idea of what's beautiful is a symmetrical face, and that's why I sort of put the beautiful in quotes, because that's we can definitely have a discussion about that, but that's a definition that's been challenged, because I think that's also one of those things that's enculturated. But if we go along with that enculturation, there is an innate aspect to it, because our brain does have an area, as in contrast to an area for a beauty circuit, for example, a specific area, there actually is a specific area for symmetry, because most living things are symmetrical. if you see a lion in the bushes, it's going to have a symmetrical face. It's going to have symmetrical movement. Of course, faces are symmetrical, so we have a face area in our brains for that reason, right? So when there's dedicated areas in our brain, there tends to be that innate component. But still, the reason I, try to emphasize that symmetry is not necessarily beautiful is that it can still be influenced, as we saw, from culture as well. So there's these, again, objective and subjective components. But to come back to this,
yeah. Would you say that you're distinguishing aesthetics and beauty? Is beauty fit? What's the Venn diagram look like?
Between aesthetics and beauty?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a hard question, because I think it comes back to that subjective nature of what somebody finds beautiful. There's ideas about, if something sort of passes this level of preference and then it's sort of retroactively, subjectively felt as beautiful.
Right.
It's still very much an open question.
Aesthetics, you're saying, is also subjective, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Doesn't necessarily mean that they're not some overlap.
Exactly. So, I think for all practical purposes, and especially for research purposes and decision-making purposes, it's convenient to say that what's aesthetically pleasing is likely what's going to be beautiful and vice versa. So, for example, this is an infant study. Infants around 6 months old, and it shows looking time. Looking time is often used as a way for decision-making in infants. And you can find that the looking time is markedly higher for the symmetric faces and the asymmetric ones are not shown here in this example, but the average face, for example. So in comparison to that average face, the infants just looked at the symmetric face longer. There's just innate attraction to beauty and the signifiers of beauty. And then, so beauty draws attention, and then taking that further, attention and action then shape preference. So this is a little bit of a complicated slide, but let me walk you through it. Here, this is a task where initially preferences are taken for faces and different snacks. So this is a behavior change study where they're trying to understand what are the initial behaviors and what are the behaviors later. So you just simply indicate, you prefer the face A, you prefer the face B, and then how much this value that you put on the snack, and then different snacks that come out. Then there's this training period, and this is the key period that has to do with attention. So in this period, what happens is that you get a series of stimuli that come up, but then you're taught, this is called a cue approach task, where a cue comes up, and in this case, a cue is an audio cue, and you're just trained to push the press bar as fast as possible. You're not saying anything. You're not saying I prefer this. You're just completing an action. And you do this over a long period of time, and then what you find later, and then you test the preferences later to see how those change. And what you find is that, and these are studies that are all, I'm only showing the data for the longitudinal studies, and the way to look at this graph is the go items are the ones that you were told to press go on, to actually hit the space bar. So you see that all of them are above 10, and some of these, for example, experiment 6 was almost 6 months after the first experiment was done. So it's long-term behavior change that has happened, just simply from what you would say is a very simple task. You're just sitting there trying to press a space bar as in response to a cue. And why is this happening? This is happening because there's this profound connection between attention and action. That is the fundamental component of approach and behavior, and what shapes behavior. And so it's a really profound illustration that if attention and action shape preference and beauty shapes attention, then you can appreciate that beauty can, in a sense, create this type of behavior change as well. And I'll show you some evidence for that. But first I want to show you a little bit about attention that can actually be used as a behavior intervention. So in this case, again, this is an example of a go, no-go task where you just simply show the images and you said, at a no-go, try to inhibit your response, and a go, try to press a spacebar or a click. And you find, again, that in this case, there's actually long-term behavior change for healthy foods and preferences for healthy foods up to 6 months, 9 months after. just simply for a task like this. And why is that happening? It goes back to the original slide I showed, where your attention is drawn to those types of food and the components and the statistics and the underlying characteristics of those types of things.
So just to clarify my understanding, so when you're tasked with taking action, clicking simply on images of healthy food, you show random images, but look for and click and act on the healthy food.
Yeah.
That later shapes your influences your behavior towards eating healthy food or preferring healthy food.
Yes, exactly.
It influences, or it says this is your behavior. This is your preferred behavior.
Do you mean, can you tell me how you're differentiating this?
So what I understood of that response was, let's say we are trying to go to someone and say, why don't you start eating vegetables? We were talking about this earlier, right? So we show them vegetables all the time and make them press the button. And does that influence their behavior going forward? Or is this an example of saying that put different types of food in front of them and see how they react to each of the food? Do they go or they no go?
I see. So so this actually was developed into an app-based intervention where they did exactly what you're saying, and it led to actual behavior changes in preference for healthy foods, so like actually choosing healthy foods down the line.
Isn't that manipulative?
I worked on a choice architecture project with Google around incentivizing healthy food choices, especially in a frictionless environment where you're not paying for anything.
Okay.
And we actually did advertising around vegetables. So we were placing ads, making veggies look sexy, basically. And we found that in that particular cafe, 23% more veggie consumption within a 6-month period, which is
it
quite
makes
a lot.
sense for some positive behavior, but this is also very.
It's definitely, I think the debate is definitely there.
Okay.
That's generally true in the whole field. The question is like the moral line is do you get permission, and most of the time you can say if you do it by permission, then that's morally okay. But there's cases where like people don't believe in climate change, but you still need them to curb their climate consumption or whatever. But potentially,
intent would have to play a role as well.
What's that?
Intent would have to play a role as well.
Sure.
Right.
Is there a difference in the amount of no-goes? Like, do you need the no-go in order to effectively get like the type of behavior change?
Oh, in terms of like the proportion of no-goes?
Yes.
So the no-goes are always balanced out in terms of, I don't know the specifics. That's really a question about, if you include, let's say only like 3 no-goes and like 30 no-goes. Yeah, I'm sure that there's like a magical proportion. I'm not off the top of my head. I haven't run one of these types of studies before, so I'm not familiar, but there's definitely an influence of the amount of no-goes, so like the inhibition that you're doing. And it goes to a related test that's, if you're interested in this, called the Q, before I said the Q approach test. So it sort of tries to bring in this idea of like everything else as a no-go and it's go signal. Whereas here now there's 2 signals, it's a no-go signal and it's a go signal, right? So you can sort of tease that apart too. Is it the signal? Is it the lack of signal? Is it the action? It's a really fascinating sort of area because it's hacking, sort of say like this attention action loop, and just sort of making you do it over and over again, and you're just sort of hijacking your attention. And so speaking of ethical, you can do this in it's something called attentional bias modification training, where you can do the same sort of thing, where you make the positive faces the faces that you want to reduce bias, right? So you can make you can just make those the positive faces, and there's correlation between those being some things that stand out because their brains. We're looking at a room. I'm looking at the ones that that are happy. So this is a natural tendency. So you can actually then connect that to say, well, how can we use this for quote unquote good? But that's something that is an example of attention that is shaped by this explicit experience. But attention is also shaped by fundamental things, and extremely fundamental things to this degree. Where when you look at the first levels of visual cortex, for example, there's this attentional preference for a certain amount of a certain degree of orientations, and it turns out that those orientations that are most preferred, that our visual first layer of our visual system is most activated by, have to do with the types of orientations that are found in faces, right? So it's like, what I'm hoping to continue to build a story on is this profound connection between attention and how our brain is set up and the innate sources that come from that, combined with the learning that comes from your own experience. So this is an example of attentional forces that are shaped by your experience. And going back to this study, not going back, but it's an actual study of how plating can shape preferences and behavior. In this study, plating, and this is actually a graph. So plating was shaped, this was oriented in all different directions. And then here, this was also oriented as a test in all different directions. And you can see the graph shows that there's this 45-degree bias in plating. And that's coming from our 45-degree bias in the processing of faces from the last slide. So like, it's fundamental biases, and you see this in nature as well. There's also, this bias for like T-shapes, because that's generally how gravity tends to bring things down into the trees. So there's these fundamental things that are happening at very, very fundamental levels. And just as a side, I think this is a really interesting area for, as we're developing these AI technologies, these image recognition systems, we could sort of try to get them to learn from our preferences what they are, and they might learn something similar to this. Or we can try to inform them from this fundamental science and say, look, at the neuronal level, at this layer, there's actually this orientation selection. And it's happening for this specific reason. That's connected to evolution and the environment. And it remains to be seen whether that, for example, is a better or worse approach in terms of shaping and creating agents that are, just more friendly and easier to get along with and share our preferences and learn the same way that we do. Another example of innate aesthetic biases is for curved objects. And I don't know if has anybody seen the Tesla Cybertruck that's riding around in Austin? Yeah. It just looks like something out of a simulation. Like, it just looks unreal, because it truly is unreal. I think I do appreciate it for that. But when you look at these studies about like objects and the preference around that, you find that for curvature, there's a strong preference. And this is just an example that compares actual objects like watches or sofas with geometric diagrams or images that you might be recognizable but are still geometric. And you find that consistently there's this higher percentage of light responses for the curved contours. And this is found for, when you go down into the nitty-gritty of it and really start to vary the contour and the lines in a controlled way, going from, very angular down here or very curved down up there. And you still see that in all of these there's a strong preference for curvature. And again, that comes from this fundamental preference that comes from things that are not pointy and likely not going to kill you, right? So those things are actually shaping them. That fundamental thing is shaping and biasing our attention and our action, but that's in the end biasing our attention for something like the decision to buy a Cybertruck, right? So it's that connection is not just stopping there. Yeah.
It's very tricky for me to think about all this, because at the same time, right, the Cybertruck is so unusual that it might demand more attention.
Yeah.
Right? It's unexpected in its design, and also you don't see many of them, and so the attention for it might be higher. When you see it, pay more attention than another car that might go by. So in this case, there would maybe be an inverse relationship between attention and aesthetic preference.
Yeah.
Well, part of it is definitely it's intentionally polarizing.
Right.
Which is good for players.
Right.
Yeah.
Draws it.
So there's actually really interesting research around this, and you might be familiar with logos. So companies that want to stand out as being cutting edge go for the angular logos because they're trying to be quote unquote cutting edge. They actually are seen as, in terms of their ratings, they're actually seen as more advanced and sort of can shape that preference because they're different and stand out, as opposed to the standard curved shape. And you can definitely see this back and forth conversation as you're describing, for sure, between what is the innate component and what is the learned component, and how that shapes. If your environment is vast, and this is like a whole area of this field where it's like, if I'm in this environment that's all curved objects, then I'm actually underfitting my environment, right? What could be out there, because I have not seen any curved objects. So it's actually really, really important that I pay attention to sharp objects. And because those are important, I haven't seen them before, I better pay attention to them. So as I start to see more of them, they'll get more and more of my attention to that, and then eventually they'll sort of progress to the mean. So there's this fascinating connection between these studies that look at reinforcement learning and how you can sort of feed them different categories of objects and shapes, and how they sort of shift their attention towards something that is not currently in the model versus something that's in the model. And in the end, it really just comes down to that, right? Like, what is this useful for me for? The innate component is just something that has worked, but we're, in many cases, a vastly, vastly different environment. So it would be really silly to not include the sense and ability to learn new things and to break, for example, even something as profound neurally asymmetry that has a dedicated region for it. You can still overcome that.
So there's sort of a threshold of like the unknown, because in general, the more something's too unknown, then you can't predict what's safe or not safe. So
yeah.
But because going to sort of like group evolutionary theory, red brain, blue brain kind of ideas, there's like in a group of people, for evolutionary and experiential purposes, some people are leaning towards, oh, that's weird, dude, I'm going to go over there and check it out, and others hold back to see whether they're going to die from eating with those red berries or whatnot, and so having that balance, right?
The exploration, exploitation balance.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah, I'd love to talk about that later, because it's a really interesting. I think that just essentially defines like how you navigate the world and what your preferences are. Is that balance about how much you're exploring and how much you're exploiting?
Right.
Yeah, it's definitely fundamental. So one last thing before I sort of conclude this first portion, which is that, and this is just one example, is that beauty is not just about attention, it's about other things that then connect to that are quote unquote good. So beauty is connected, for example, to honesty judgments, and these are facial attractiveness ratings. And here, there's targets that have high and low honesty in a task. And you can find that the attractiveness rating is always higher for those that are more honest in this task, regardless of if they were rated as less attractive before or high attractive before. So regardless of your initial starting state of how attractive you found this face, if it's associated with an honest act, that it actually ends up being more beautiful than a less honest act. More beautiful for an honest act. Yeah.
So in both ways.
How do you mean? Oh yeah, exactly. So beauty and honesty, yeah, exactly. And then, so not showing a lot of these studies here that have to do with multitude of these findings. For example, the same type of finding is found with trust, is found with morality. People that are beautiful are just found to be more moral. They're punished less, right? So there's this like innate sort of connection between, if it's attracting my attention, and if it's something that seems good to me, then it might also have good characteristics to it as well. And I think you can imagine that that's essentially what a lot of the back end of like marketing and design and all those things are built on, is to just signal those things, right? So beauty in the end is a signal, and honesty can be one of the things that is signals. So to summarize this first portion, our sense of beauty is shaped by many factors, both innate and learned. What is beautiful to us is what grabs our attention, and vice versa. And then beauty biases choice and advises our cognition as well. So in the second part, I want to sort of zoom out a little bit and talk about this social component of beauty and aesthetics. So, and this goes specifically, when you think about the social components, it goes to this component of identity, about who we are. So when you think about, what is your identity? You're likely going to describe the things that you like, your likes, the things that you hate. You might even describe the things that you hate first before the things that you dislike, or you like. You might describe it as the things that you experience that shapes who your identity is. Like, I was there, I live here, this is my environment. And if you're creative, you might describe it as what you create. It's what you either create through curation or what you actually actively create. And I hope you can appreciate that these are all deeply aesthetic in nature. Right? So these are not just things that are outside of these components of beauty, that these are deeply aesthetic in nature. So building on this, the connection between aesthetics and preferences and social components, our likes and dislikes say a lot about who we are. So we talked about in the first part about how they're a signal. We talked about honesty, for example, but it's also, research shows, a signal for a whole range of a gamut of values. If you look at in this study, for example, that I'll be showing, you can take a value assessment questionnaire and you can sort of very reasonably reliably predict what somebody's values are from their aesthetic taste, like their music taste, for example. So, and what that allows us to do is to use aesthetics as a social shortcut, right? So rather than saying, hey, so what is your personality and what do you value at a cocktail party? You can say, hey, what type of music do you listen to? And that tells you a lot about that person. You know, the amount that they're exploring, the amount they're displaying, if they're really the type of personality, the values that come with it. You can get a lot from that. And you can actually see that this creates the research shows that this creates a socially attractive force. So in this study, people were asked their likes and dislikes. They were actually asked to give their likes and dislikes first. And then they were given the likes and dislikes of other people, and then they found some people that were similar, some people that were not, and they were asked to give this interpersonal rating of how much would you like to get to know this person more. And not surprisingly, in the shared component, and I'm not showing the unshared component, but basically the unshared component is lower, but there's two results here. That there's in the shared component, there's this liking that happens, but interestingly, that the interpersonal liking is more connected to what other people like versus what if you have similarities with what you dislike. So if two people, for example, dislike the movie Inception, that might be a reason, but you might have disliked it for a very different reason than I might have. I might not like, for example, The Lent, and you might not just like DiCaprio as an actor. There's just so many reasons that could go into that, whereas like is usually a better signal of like, okay, this person likes it for, if they made a like judgment, it's likely for a consistent reason. Though there's some variability there as well, but it gives you socially more information than perhaps a dislike does. And now there's also here, as in all of these things, a really sort of deep well of research that has to do with what's called the rare preference effect, where if you go to a party and you say, hey, everyone, I like Mac, you're not really going to be somebody who, you have shared preferences with everybody, for example, at an SF party, but you're not going to be somebody that most people want to actively talk to, because who doesn't like Mac in an SF party? But if you say oh, hey, yeah, I was just working on my Raspberry Pi, that's a rare preference, and that gives you some unique information about the individual and the values that they have and the personality that they have. So at the end of the day, likes, the lesson is that preferences are the signal, and as long as they maintain that signal, they create this interpersonal liking. And in scenarios where all that changes, where everything is profoundly different in terms of environment or social structure, then giving the opposite signal, social conformity, anti-conformity, can perhaps be better. But that's a whole another world. So I want to also share a study that we ran here in terms of our preferences being a social signal. So in this study, I asked people that, I gave them different scenarios. The scenarios were either a friendship or a dating scenario, in which you were told that, hey, you're going to be signing up for this friendship or dating service. Which one of these categories would your top 10 list, would you want to share with this group before you actually go and meet them? And then there was another context, which was work/exclusive, which was about, you're going to be applying for a job, or you're going to be applying for a very exclusive social club. And which one of your top 10 preferences, they've given you an option. Pick the one that you would want to most share to them so that you accomplish your goal. And I think, as you can see, there's a really interesting point here, is that these aesthetic preferences are a social signal that are being shaped by the context that we're in. So in the friendship and dating context, the proportion that's picked more has to do with music and TV shows and movies, and books are picked less. And then books and the opposite is picked, especially in the work and exclusive context, in terms of sharing. Artworks, for example, are much more shared in the work and exclusive context. If you're applying for a social club, you probably want to tell them, hey, these are my top 10 favorite artists that I like to have at my home, as opposed to here's the music that I want. So there's this like world of identity and signaling that comes to this functional component. And this is then replicated in terms of what would you prefer to receive, right? So like, okay, is this just a signal that you're putting out there, but perhaps when you receive it, is it something different? And we see that it's generally the same story. When you ask people the same question, and you say, hey, you are now the head of an exclusive club, and people are applying, what is one thing that you would hope that they would tell you out of these 4 categories, 5 categories, that would help you make the best decision? And again, you see a similar pattern. So it goes to show that there's this connection between preferences being a social signal.
I had a question about the demographic that you surveyed. And also wanted to share, I'm big into the art and music scene here in Austin. We say music is a love language. So it's cool to see that validated in those results.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I did this online in basically what was like a pretty wide open range from 18 to 60. So it was definitely not limited to like university students.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then my question would be whether most of the questions were asked the same people and consecutively. So basically my assumption would be like, oh, if I already said that I would share this, I want to stay consistent with like, so I'll most likely would like to receive the same. Like,
yeah, so this was what you would call a between subjects design. So it was a new set of subjects, completely new set of subjects for us. Yeah, very good question. Because yes, absolutely, you probably want to stay consistent. No, but this was completely new set of subjects for each thing to ensure that there is not that rollover effect. So further illustrating this connection between identity and aesthetics and the social component, for this study, I want you to imagine the question that the participants were asked, which is that you went from liking the paintings like the one on the left to the one that are on the right. You're given a scale from 1 to 5. How different of a person would you be if your preferences changed? And here is the results for this, the perceived change in identity on a scale from 1 to 7, actually. And they were actually given this for food, for music as well. And you can see that for art and music, actually, there is a greater difference than there is for food, in terms of the means at least, in terms of what your identity, perceived identity is. So if your taste changed, that means you changed. So there's this connection between identity and who you are, as well as your taste. So it's something that reflects who you are. It's a way to almost gauge where you are, and then going back, then it's a really good social signal to understand what other people are.
Did you define for us close genres and far genres?
Yeah, so example of, from what I remember, like a far genre was like gospel and rock music.
Okay.
And I can't remember top of my head what a close genre was, but basically it was something, to
so from this to this.
Exactly. A big jump versus exactly. So like, you went from just a very massive jump to a small jump. So yeah, there's interesting stuff here about how much that changed in follow-up studies, and there's also like within this follow-up experiment where they asked, like, imagine you went from not liking going to the art museum and beauty to liking doing that, and that showed a profound change in identity. So they're simply the act of being an aesthetically engaged person is something that has identity associated with it.
Were there very much changes in genders?
No, from what I recall, there was no significant effect of gender on this study. In terms of how aesthetic experience also connects to a sense of self and identity, is that building on this idea of engaging with aesthetic experiences, they promote self-reflection. So neuroscience studies find that art engages the default mode network, this is a network that's engaged when we think about who we are as part of the world, is engaged in many other similar paradigms where the individual sort of situates himself as part of the broader context. So it promotes, the aesthetic experience itself sort of promotes a self-reflection and self-observation. And in that sense, it connects to behavior change directly, because when you think about aesthetic engagement, and this is a piece of evidence that I didn't have time to go over today, but it's strongly connected. One of the things that's strongly connected to, for example, that study that I described about music, is that you can predict people's preferences, their personality from the big five traits, especially in terms of openness to experience. If they're, for example, have a preference for abstract art, or even politically, you can sort of predict that preference. So this connects you to that exploitation idea, that aesthetic engagement leads you to have more openness to experience, which is a signal for exploration. That exploration is internal as well as external, right? So you have this enhanced awareness, but you're also exploring new options. Just simply going to a gallery and seeing symbols that are put out there, engaging aesthetically, leads to, and this is David and I presented, but these are actual shifts that have been done as interventions, like a beauty intervention, for example, where you're actually go from a group that is just asked to go to galleries and engage in beautiful things and reflect on the 9 beautiful things, for example, that they saw that day. They actually lead to this level of growth and self-reflection that is critical to behavior change.
Sorry, I'm sure you said this, but could you restate aesthetic engagement, how it's defined or measured?
Yeah, so there's different ways to think about it, but basically, I would say the general component is like your tendency. So there's a few scales for it, but it's like, do you notice things that are beautiful out there? Do you engage with art? It's questions around like you actually noticing beauty out there in the world and valuing it. Do you stop to take a moment to appreciate what might be beautiful? So there's this whole idea of like the desire for beauty and the sensitivity for beauty scale. That I think is really useful just as like a personal guide to be like, am I sensitive to beauty? Maybe I should be more, right? So like these are the things that have to do with aesthetic engagement. And then you can also ask more behavioral things, like how many times per 6 months do you actually visit a gallery, for example, right? So like are you actually meeting like the traditional artistic sense? Supposed to just.
But it's not purely formal beauty or art.
No. I would say it's actually more so this sense of like just a sense of being in terms of like how you're navigating the world.
Like the Grand Canyon, or like nature engagement.
Yeah, stopping to smell a rose,
or pondering on a certain fashion concept.
Exactly. So it's not. I mean, that's definitely connected and isn't necessarily teased out, but those things are generally correlated. But yeah.
Sort of like an airport. Oh, sorry.
No worries. I was curious if there's any relationship between mindfulness and aesthetic engagement or likelihood of that. Especially mindfulness meditation, people being more present in the now, allowing for that kind of observation, noticing, savoring.
Yeah.
Research around that.
So that's a topic that's really interesting to me because it's almost a mindfulness to not internal experience, which is how mindfulness is thought of, right? Like about how am I feeling internally?
Yeah.
But it's more so about noticing the environment that you're in, like the aesthetics of this garage door that we're in, or this plant here. Like actually appreciating the way that this environment was curated. That's external. The way I've seen sort of silly, it's an external mindfulness, and there's a connection to that. If you have this. There's intervention that does lead to you noticing more, and it actually leads to just a recent thing that came out is that actually leads to pro-social tendency to just be more pro-social in other tasks that you take afterwards. If you happen to be in that type of beauty sensitive type mindset engagement. Yeah.
You might have just answered this too, but if the aesthetic engagement, is that purely of things that are beautiful or like attractive, or is it just the awareness of the aesthetic?
I think it's the latter, because it's awareness of understanding and simple awareness of like, is this beautiful to me? And it, and I think it's almost like it's almost like a road that once you take, you can sort of go back and you can't help but notice like the environment that you're in and how it's shaping you and whether something is affecting you in a way that it's perhaps not aesthetically pleasing and something that is. So that contrast, all those things, it's that general tendency. That's part of how this is measured, is that general tendency. So it's one part of it.
Okay.
It's a really good question about, like, it might not always be that you have to be surrounded by purely beautiful things, but this tendency to notice what is beautiful, find the beauty.
So if you had two non-attractive dishes, you wouldn't really think about the actual aesthetics of it. But if you had a beautiful one next to a non-beautiful, then you would have a little bit more. Somebody might have like more of an awareness of it.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I think there's this idea of choice between options that are sort of similarly valued if they're both really beautiful, if they're both really ugly, for example. Like our brain just sort of tends to pick one just to break that tie because that's emotionally, that's energetically very taxing. So what's really interesting there is that breaking of that tie actually means that now that object got more attention. There's this idea of this like gaze cascade that you're looking back and forth between two things, and then you're like, you know what, I'm just going to break this tie and go here. And then you see like this graph where like now you just look here for a while, and that ends up most of the time shaping what you end up picking. But it's before in these studies you rate them as equal in terms of your preference and how beautiful you find them, for example. But later, when you ask again, that object has now become more preferred and more beautiful to you. So simply the act of noticing can essentially like imbue the world out there with this sense of preference, where if you were just sort of ambivalent about it.
Partially due to like consistency and children and stuff.
Yeah, cognitive dissonance is a huge factor. Exactly. Yeah, I think that's essential. So in terms of the channels for identity transformation, there's the self-reflection, which is engagement with aesthetic experiences that causes the social circle, the environment that you're in, the experiences that you're in, and what I've shown you is that aesthetic experiences can be a very useful tool to implement these behavior change strategies in each of these things.
In that sense, what do you mean by aesthetic experiences? Like now you are saying you make it more beautiful. That
I guess aesthetically oriented experience is probably the right word.
Meaning there's a attention paid to.
Exactly. Yes.
Right.
Like a mode, that's how it's really referred to as like a mode.
Way of thinking, which is ties to mindfulness or gratitude exercise. In a way.
Exactly, in a way, but more sort of almost like object-oriented.
Right.
So I want to leave you off with this last thing, which is that beauty is good for you. So those who are most aesthetically involved, and this is, and I'll show later like what the frequency here is, how that's defined, aesthetically involved, have a better chance of achieving this coherent identity. And this was done in a study that followed undergrad students throughout their, what is usually a transformative period in their life, and to see that those that were more aesthetically involved tended to have more resilience, they find more meaning in life, have higher self-esteem, and even have better health markers. So people who engage in receptive arts activities on a frequent basis, and now this is specifically talking about, what you were mentioning about actually going to the gallery, or some gallery or a play or a musical or something, every few months or more, had a 31% lower risk of dying, independent of demographic, socioeconomic, health-related, behavioral, and social factors. So it could really sort of, adopting this mode of appreciating, engaging with beauty not only implicitly, in your everyday life, but explicitly as well, and when it's curated for you, can lead to these very deeply beneficial effects. And I'll stop there.
Wow. That was amazing.
Thank you. Thank you for all the great questions. Really, really good questions.
And any more questions?
Yes.
Is there any qualitative research done on why people can choose to not look at 5 through lenses for someone like me, it just comes naturally, right? Like it's not something I'm interested in. But I know that there are people who maybe don't choose to stop and smell the flowers, to see the flowers, to go to galleries, or to plate their food beautifully. You know?
Yeah.
Is there any work on that?
I don't think I've come across anything that explores why. I think there's definitely findings that that does exist.
Yeah.
And then there's these findings of like diary studies into the qualitative aspect where you can tell people, you know, for example, there's a diary study where people ask for the next 6 months to note at the end of the day what they find beautiful, and then they find all of these the influences from that. But I think it's frankly a pretty new area in terms of research about, like, you know, this tendency to engage versus not engage. And it's still, even within the niche field of neuroaesthetics, it's still a further niche field. But I think it kind of has to do with like what we were talking about, exploration and exploitation. Yeah, I think that's my hunch, is that it essentially, you know, as you know, what I hope to communicate is like these things all come down to fundamental behavior, cognitive things. And what is the fundamental cognitive thing there? It's like, well, are you noticing things? Well, if you're noticing things, then you're probably expending energy. That has to do with exploration about new things, right? If you know exactly what to do and what the reward is, and you're probably just going to go exactly to that. But somebody like me, I go to the grocery store and I always look for the new snack or what's on sale so I can try something new. And that's this explorative stage, and that just means I'm more likely to notice new things. And to me, that's a really interesting topic of, like, you know, is that a personality thing? Is that something that translates between like types of behavior? Unfortunately, there's just not information about like why people don't. I think it probably comes down to, if I had to make a guess, it probably comes down to the idea of a model that you built, and you feel that your model fits the world that you live in. You know, right? So when you think about in general like behavior and the drive to actually act and change your behavior, it's most likely connected to this internal feeling of that, hey, the world out there doesn't match, or like I'm at risk of not being up to date with what's actually out in my environment, so I should probably change, because that environment change is going to cause an effect on me. But if you're just not noticing those things, then you probably, one, it's not having an effect on you that's perceptible, or you don't realize it. It is, obviously, we see, but your subjective understanding is that, like, you know, this is, I'm happy where I am. And I think that probably has to do.
And also your basic perspective of whether you feel like you're at how dangerous the world is. So we're always somewhere within the rest of the digestive and fight or flight spectrum. And if you think the world's dangerous, you kind of tend to be on that fight or flight, so you're looking for danger. And in fact, work in a way, being productive demands of society are saying, look for problems so you can fix them. Look what's wrong, what do you have to work on, And that's hard to like kind of turn off. We've got to train ourselves, and then the news and media are too. But on the flip side, like stopping and looking at what's right, what's good, what's, you know, well, that's whole gratitude practice. And get more into a ceremonial space.
Yeah, there's I'll just point out, if anybody's interested, there's a really, really fascinating paper on this called Stopping for Knowledge. That just reminded me of what you said. Is like, and the hypothesis put forward is that beauty in aesthetics is stopping for knowledge. It's actually not just you know, this vain thing. You're stopping to increase your knowledge for the moment.
Yeah. Well, with those who kind of stop from everything versus those who create, is there like does a creative have an advantage? Do they have like a way to appreciate or better experience?
Yeah. So
especially like artists or musicians.
Yeah. So I think there's this whole field of creative art therapies that tries to explore that to some degree, and I think you know, there is interesting things out there in terms of the expertise, for example, that comes from actually creation or knowledge. Right? Oftentimes, like that knowledge and creation are connected, and what you find is that even though the ratings are the same in terms of how, like, you know, how much you like a musical piece, the amount of meaning you get out of it is actually profoundly higher for those who create or are knowledgeable in the theory of how it was done. So when an art expert, for example, looks at painting versus like a naive person will, you know, artistically naive person will still perhaps say like, oh, I rate this as a, you know, 6 out of 7 because it really speaks to me. The blue is something that signals emotion, whereas the expert might say also the same thing, but they're saying 10 other reasons. Like they're saying, this was, I know how difficult this was to do. I know the cultural context about it, about when this came. I know the symbolism that this means. So there's this component of richness that comes with creation and this connection of creation to knowledge that I think while in terms of a observation in these studies that show up, when you actually look at the qualitative aspects, it does show up. So there's this depth that comes. And that's also connected to, just to sort of wrap that up, in the visual cortex, there's this really interesting finding where as you go further down the visual cortex, there's more density of opioid receptors, and opioid receptors are associated with pleasure. And as well, our visual system, for example, as you go further down, is connected to deeper and deeper integration. Right? So what happens in V1 back here is just looking at edges, and then it's curves, and it's sort of contours, and it's into concepts like faces, and etc. So what's been found is that if an object activates more of a deeper part of your brain, like more memories and associations attached to it, which would come from creation, then it tends to be naturally more pleasing because it's activated more of those opioid receptors along this circuitry as well. So there definitely is that connection between creation and knowledge.
And attention too.
Yeah, it comes with attention. Yeah, as a must. Yeah.
Towards the end, you were talking about aesthetic engagement as a pathway to growth, and we talked a lot about different studies that sort of show the correlation. Is there others, and you might have talked about this, but is it proven that there's sort of causation to we can hypothesize a lot about correlations amongst people that have adverse life events, or maybe by survival oriented, they're kind of looking down at the world instead of more expansively, and therefore they might be less aesthetically inclined and have worse health outcomes, etc. But is there research that shows that an average person becoming more aesthetically engaged also leads to sort of psychological and physiological?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, there is. There's in these interventions where you sort of have these a control arm and an arm that's actually engaging more. You actually find more meaning in life and all these these measures associated with happiness. But you also sort of just find that with just people that have careers that are associated with that naturally. So it happens sort of in a natural experiment, but then in an actual experiment, it does happen. Back there.
I was curious if you know how these concepts apply to usability and design. So I guess a oversimplified way to put it is will people use something that works or use something that's beautiful, and where maybe that starts to cross over, where I'll sacrifice some usability if it's beautiful, but only to a certain extent, because there's something I need to do. I'm thinking that's mostly online tasks, but eventually I need the thing to work, right?
Yeah.
And so where that sweet spot.
Test.
Right, I mean what test also, what's the neuro,
definitely testing, but there is I think in the UX world it's sort of known as this, I can't recall, but it's this this functionality bias that comes from I think the study that was done was with an ATM that was the interface in one end was designed to be symmetric and organized, and the other end wasn't, but they both were functional, but people were more willing to put up with the symmetric interface because they associated, just like as those signals of honesty and trust and morality, goodness with aesthetics. So that does definitely carry over in terms of it's called the aesthetic usability effect, as you're talking about. But it's definitely that that fine balance of is it just only the aesthetic component, but not. But I would say that it does create. I would, if I had to sort of pick the balance between the two, I would say that the aesthetic component likely wins out, because at the end of the day, usability is a judgment, right? So and studies like the ATM one shows that where they're actually equally usable if you look at it objectively, but subjectively it's a judgment that came from the difference in aesthetics. And this connects to this, if you're interested in this, whole, and this was sort of the first part of my dissertation, was this thing called, this theory called processing fluency theory. So some of you might be familiar with it, that really directly connects like these ideas here to interface design and marketing and how what's fluent is what's usable, what's fluent. You know, there's just I feel like almost everything there's a study about. You know, like fluent stock names tend to be picked more and do better, and you know just.
You say it's processing fluency. That's
theory. Yes.
Fluency meaning it's like easy for you to consume. Like you feel like you get it.
Like black text on white versus gray text.
Exactly, like a call to action that's easy to read. I just saw earlier today, as I was sort of doing more research for this, was that a questionnaire that is easy to read about your subjective meaning in life actually led to more subjective meaning in life, which is I don't know how to interpret that, but like if you just found the questionnaire hard to read and it was less fluent, you just felt like you had less meaning on your life on that process.
Right.
So yeah.
I would say this is my number one like lesson for a lifetime of design is that issue is that like the big takeaway from is that it's complex and that we as creators, it's fluid to us.
Yes.
It's aesthetic to us, and therefore we imbue it with truth. We confuse truth and beauty, and therefore think, well, of course, it's right for everybody. And it feels like, I'm not saying like that's a mistake. It really feels like you know the solution. This is true of investors, it's true of presidents, it's true of all of us. And so we invest so much of our lives chasing things that we are convinced is true that is not true. It's bullshit. And we have to finally learn the only way to know if we're trying to solve something for somebody else is that we have to test. And convincing people to pay for testing and like getting the testing and the time for testing. But I've worked with so many companies that are, as many of you have, and they will spend so much money and just throw it away, and then a year or two later, pretend that never happened, and start all over again because they didn't test. So it is cheaper in the long run than the short run. So it's really, that is a big question. Like, we don't know. But aesthetics blinds us to a lot of things.
Yeah, and part of that is like you can sort of use that as a force for good to lead that. And,
for sure,
yeah, and then basically, as soon as you sort of dip your toes into processing fluency, the first thing that comes up is that it's subjective. It's not objective, and that's because of these forces of innate forces and learning that are combining, and depending on your experience, your current state. All of those things sort of combining to what is fluent to you at that moment, or more likely to be fluent to you. So it is definitely that subjective component that, what's fluent to you might not be for me, and so I think that does definitely underscore the need for testing.
At the same time, you also showed us that there's a lot of objective parts to it as well, and so now as I'm reflecting more, but they're not like, we're not privy to them by default. Our intuitions don't necessarily say, well, people overwhelmingly prefer blue to other colors, or treat that as more trustworthy, or symmetry, or like we think, oh, I know that's a bias, but we don't realize how impactful that is until the science shows us how powerful that is. And when you start to stack those kind of objective biases together, you can get outcomes in your designs that are much higher than you would by just trusting your own instincts.
I think Google knows how to do that.
I think everybody knows a little bit how to do it. More research-based companies do it, but you can tell, you watch any company, and you will constantly bitch about their software or their products because they will not use the best practices that they've done in previous products or like competing products. Or like, the reason I know that OpenAI doesn't have AGI inside internally yet that they're not telling us about is because the gap between their mobile app and their web-based version, this one has search and this one doesn't. And obviously, both need to have search. And supposedly AI can code for you, right? Well, clearly it can't code a search function into their web page. So, like those kind of gaps in everything humans do just show that we trust our opinion what we should do way too much. We should be doing much more science-based, evidence-based focus. And even companies that know that, even I know that. We all know that, but we don't do it with every project because it's an investment. Yeah.
hard.
Yeah, and I feel like good designers sort of implicitly,
Suspicious.
yeah, they implicitly sort of change their design based on that.
Yes.
Picking up on this cues without, I mean, like, you know, you can definitely tell from my PowerPoint designs that as much as I know about this topic, it's not something that I can practice.
Right.
But it's something, those that are good designers are just that's by virtue of being a good designer, are being able to sort of practice and change the audience, communicate, you know, from angular design to signal. For example, like this is going to be edgy logo, or they might not be thinking about the evolution.
They do that a bit more, they do it 20% more than average.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This was really fun.
Really good.
Thank you.
But I especially love it Friday. You talked about your types of it actually aesthetics and behavior. I didn't expect the whole thing about changing over time.
Yeah, that was also I think my disclosure research is like how people change. Because it was just like, I think this ends up being sort of like an unexplored question. Is that like, well, how can you tell somebody's preference changing? Track like how much they're actually.
Yeah, you don't track that.
But it's hard to, you know, you haven't really. Original launch would be great. I did one.
Can we give validations for meetings?
Yeah, always for the meetings, yeah. I'm not sure.
You're all are.
Yeah, it's usually Friday or Monday.
We were just walking over running late, so
And that's also because maybe that would be
Yeah, so it's definitely the question you're asking is definitely something that was done. So that was that wasn't as recent. It was in 2013 or so, and since then there's been more sort of like this like to make really this one like how informative because it makes you stand out, signals that value. It's essentially this like is Yeah, I'm not with that. Yeah, it's almost you're saying that, you know, I'm not going to. What they like, but when you think about it, it's actually, it is still like liking. Other people like, but likes turned into not like, but likes. So my